Hello again, Jonathan here at Casino Guitars. Today we're going to talk about something pretty cool. We're going to talk about tube amps. And in particular, not just tube amps, but there is a sort of a hotly debated issue in the tube amp world of, is hand-wired a better thing when you buy a tube amp than PCB? I've heard about this stuff forever when you're talking about boutique amplifiers or, you know, some of the more common, the big names like a Fender or Vox or Marshall, where you might get a PCB, and we're going to talk about what those things are in just a second. But I think it's really hard when you hear these terms and you hear all these things get thrown out. Should you be looking for a hand-wired tube amp? Does it matter? Does it sound better? Is it different? So we're gonna kind of try to unpack that a little bit today. We're gonna try to say, you know, what does that mean? What is PCB? What is hand-wired? What is point-to-point? And then figure out which one is right for you, or does it matter at all? Maybe it doesn't matter at all. I think it probably does, but maybe not in the way that you imagine. So before we even do that, I thought it would be fun and maybe give you some context of my sort of amp journey briefly. The first tube amp I ever had, I bought in a pawn shop in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. As a teenager, my friend James and I we had gone to the beach for the day or whatever, bumming around, as teenagers often do. I think it was either the summer before I graduated high school or maybe the summer right after, but found this amp. I didn't even know what tube amps were. I was pretty ignorant in the subject, and I was like, man, what are these weird light bulb looking things in the back? I just knew it was cool. I knew it said Fender. I knew it was way bigger than the weird little horrible green Randall practice amp I had, and so I bought it that day at the beach for cash from a pawn shop, and it happened to be a Fender Hot Rod DeVille, the 410 version, and I loved it. And so I looked it up, what are tubes or valves, as our friendly European brethren call them, and realized, man, I dig tubes. I like this. But what I did not know was that was just the tip of the iceberg, that there were a million different sort of incarnations of tube amps, different types of tubes and different construction, and I didn't even have any idea yet about the boutique stuff. So from that, I sort of graduated to a 410 Bassman reissue that I played for ages and ages and ages until a bus I was traveling in on the way to play a show in Denver, Colorado, ran off the road into a field in a blizzard and shook that amp in its case so hard that there were like screws and things falling out of the chassis when I took the lid off. So I had that for a while. In Nashville, I got into random like vintage old Fender heads, like mostly the piggyback stuff. Like I had old Tremoluxes and Bandmasters and Bassman heads. I loved all that stuff. I had some Voxes, no vintage Voxes, just production Voxes. Around that time too, I was buying smaller combo amps. Like I had a 68 Custom Deluxe, Deluxe Reverb Fender for a while, the 68 Custom, the Silverface series. I love that. I used to run that with a little special edition Vox AC15 in stereo. That was a cool time. I ended up buying a vintage Super Reverb. Going through all this stuff, all that stuff in my brain was better. It was vintage, it was older, it was hand-wired. There's the buzzword. I don't even know at the time if I knew really why I thought hand-wired was better. I just thought the old stuff sounded cool and it sounded better. I did know, and we'll hit on this again, that the hand-wired stuff, when I took it to my amp guy in Nashville, it seemed to be that it was easier to work on, that it pretty much anything that went wrong with those amps could be fixed. That's why, those 50, 60-year-old amps are still around and people are able to gig with them and be on the road with them. But anyways, eventually I got interested in a company called Supro. And that is actually what brought me through the door of Casino Guitars. On the very first day I ever walked in here, I had Googled super amps after I moved back to North Carolina, saw that this little shop in Southern Pines had them, and ended up buying a Royal Reverb from Baxter. That was how he and I met. So there's some cool history. I've actually owned 4 or 5 Supros at this point. Maybe not that many, maybe 3 or 4 Supros. Yeah, actually 2 Royal Reverbs, a Comet, and a Statesman. There you go. Four Supros. And then eventually, most recently, I just brought a Magnetone. So that sort of brought me totally into the boutique amplifier world. So all that to say, I've been through all these amps. I've tried a bunch of different amps. And it's only recently that I think, started to get my head around, why is hand-wired? Why does it matter? What is that conversation about? Is it a thing? Here's sort of what I have sussed out as far as tube amps go and their construction. There are PCB amps, which stands for printed circuit board. So printed circuit board are the little resin boards, and they're covered in the copper stuff, and they actually like etch away the copper and leave these little paths that you can solder, I'll say that word, components to. And it is, it's a little different than the hand-wired way, where maybe you have sort of eyelet or turret boards, and then there are components sort of mounted to that and then hand-wired together, just wire to wire with solder. And then there are actually true point-to-point amps where each component is attached to the next component. They're not really necessarily mounted to anything. A lot of people, I think, get caught up on hand-wired amps, and there is like a little bit of magic, it seems, in the hand-wired stuff. But some of the PCB amps are fantastic, and there's some reasons you might want that. There's some reasons you might want point-to-point. There's also some reasons you might not. So let's go through them all and just talk about why you might want one over the other and what are the differences. Point-to-point is sort of the purest way to have a hand-wired amp. It's where, every component, every resistor, all the tube sockets, everything, they're just soldered to the next component in the chain. It is by far the most labor-intensive and probably the most skilled work. When you look at them, they're beautiful. They're gorgeous. Like if you pull the chassis out of a point-to-point amp, they look gorgeous. They look neat. You can tell this is something someone did with some really skilled work. It's craftsmanship, Now, there are very few actually straight up legit point-to-point amp makers around today. Like most amps are either, they're hand-wired, but they have something in there, whether it's terminal strips or eyelet boards. We'll talk about that in a second. But ones that are just straight up, there is nothing else other than the components wired to each other. Like Carr does that. They're a North Carolina amp company. They're great. Matchless does that. I think some of the bad cat amps are that way. Obviously, it takes a lot more there's a lot that can go wrong, I suppose, when one person is soldering every joint. Nothing's mounted. And I suppose those amps, if they're not done well and if they're not done right, they could, maybe they're less roadworthy, I've heard actually. And I in my brain, I always thought, point-to-point is the best. But turns out that maybe there are situations where they might not be as reliable because there's nothing that those components are mounted to. Now, when might that be ideal? If it's a simple circuit, if you want an amp that is absolutely just the purest sort of signal path it can be, as far as old school, somebody did every joint in there, by hand, and you just want to pull it out and say, wow, this is a piece of, absolutely fantastic craftsmanship. Point-to-point works. Obviously, matchless amps sound fantastic. Obviously, Carr amps sound fantastic. But there are a lot of reasons why not every amp company is doing that. First off, it's expensive because it's very labor intensive. So while that is absolutely cool to see an amp that is totally point-to-point, it's not always the most cost-effective or the most sort of road-worthy path to go down. That being said, let's move over to hand-wired. What does hand-wired mean? Now, point-to-point gets thrown around a lot, even with hand-wired amps. But like I said, to really be true point-to-point, those components aren't mounted to anything. So most of the hand-wired stuff that we actually talk about today, those components they're still mounted to something. And this was true for the old vintage Fender amps as well. They had these little eyelet boards, the components are on there, and then they're hand-wired together. So like vintage Fenders, Magnetone, I believe, uses terminal strips that are laid down end to end. And some people would argue that that's point to point. I probably lean towards the fact that it's hand wired. I don't know if it's exactly point to point, but definitely a true hand wired amp. Dr. Z uses eyelet boards. There's all kinds of brands who are boutique hand wired amps, but they're not necessarily point to point. Now, here's what's cool about hand wired. When you pull hand wired stuff out in the chassis and you look at it, if something goes wrong, a component goes bad, something needs to be resoldered, something shakes loose, a skilled amp tech or somebody who's good with soldering, good with their hands, they can look at that thing, figure out what's wrong, and solder it back, and it's pretty easy to work on. It's kind of like old sort of 70s Chevrolet and GMC and Ford trucks in my brain. When I open the engines of those things, I look at them and you can kind of see what's what, how everything works. When I grew up on a farm with my dad, we were able to fix those trucks. We had old 70s Fords and GMCs that had been running forever, and those trucks are still running. We can still fix them. You can still, open the hood and work on them. Now, newer cars, when I open them and there's 15 computers and I have no idea what's going on, I can't so much work on them. So I think there's something to be said for hand wired that what the components are, you can see it, they're easy to keep running, they're easier probably maybe to maintain or to fix. And again, I think that's why some of those, not some, a lot of the old 50s Fender stuff and 60s Fender stuff is still out on the road. It's still roadworthy because it can be maintained. Now, why might hand wired not be the deal? When you get into some higher gain amps and you get into more complicated switching and more complicated circuits, when you do things by hand, you're not going to be down to the thousandth of the millimeter, as far as where the wires are and where the connections are. And I've read that sometimes as much as 1 millimeter difference in where something's connected can change the tone fairly drastically on a higher gain amplifier. So, there might be times, especially the more complicated the circuit gets, that you might not want a hand wired amp because you want things to be, as streamlined and as the same as they can be, so that every amp sounds the same, so that you get the same tones. It's not, a guessing game of, is this amp going to be really bright and this amp's going to be dark. And when you play old vintage amps, they are different. You find great ones, you find bad ones. Some of that is the speaker, but my guess is that some of that is in the hand wiring, and it's why you might have to go play 10 vintage deluxe reverbs before you find the one. Now, all that to say, when you get into these great amps that I love, like Magnetones and things that are hand wired, those guys, they are very skilled. They have it down. They are very consistent amplifiers, but that's what you're paying for. That takes time, and it takes people who know what they're doing. You can't hire a dude off the street. You have to have someone who has experience, who is really trained, and who is really dedicated to their craft to make those things consistent, to make them sound good. So that brings us over to PCB, where you have the little printed circuit boards. Those amps sometimes get a bit of a bad rap. A good PCB amp is actually great sounding. All the newer Fender stuff, the reissue Fenders, that's all PCB. There's a lot of modern amps, like I said, that are more complicated circuits that are PCB. The advantage there is that once you figure out the layout of the circuit, you can do it. You can do all the solder joints at once. You're saving a ton of time. You're not paying someone to go in and solder every little spot by hand. So you're consistent, you're saving time, and therefore a lot of times they are less expensive to make, which translates to an amp that sometimes is more affordable for the consumer. So not a bad thing at all. In the beginning, some of the PCB boards were not as reliable. Technology's come a long way. They've gotten better at making those connections more reliable, making them a little more hardy, a little more roadworthy. So I would say these days, nothing in the world wrong with a PCB amp. And like I said, there are tons of actual advantages as far as saving on labor, saving on costs, and making things exactly the same every time, so that you get amps that sound exactly the same over and over and over again, especially on really complicated circuits that you're able to shrink down and put in smaller enclosures. So that's a fantastic thing. The Supros, like I talked about, that I love, and I've had a ton of those, they are sort of what we'd call maybe like a hybrid construction. They actually have 3 PCB boards in most of those, and then some hand-wired components like the tube sockets and things like that. There's a ton of amps like that have hybrid construction. So maybe there's a PCB in there with a circuit board and some things wired to it, but then there might be sort of hand-wired components mixed in. So hopefully, with all that said, and it's, you know, a lot for even my brain to be around, hopefully that clears up in your brain what's point-to-point, what's hand-wired, what's PCB. So maybe to summarize it, if you want a high gain, very complicated channel switching amp, and you want them to be exactly the same every time, super consistent, PCB is probably not a bad way to go, especially to keep costs down. If you've got sort of maybe a simpler vintage inspired sort of design that, you know, you're just really, you want to make sure it's done by hand by people the way maybe Fender amps were done in the 50s. Hand wired's maybe the way to go on terminal strips, eyelet board, or turret board, you know, not a bad thing. There does seem to be some intangible magic to the hand-wired amps that I've played. Is that in my mind? I don't know. Why does my Magnetone sound so good? I don't know. Why do my old vintage Fenders, why do they sound so amazing when you find a good one? I don't know. Is it in the hand wiring? It's hard to say, but absolutely go play some hand-wired amps. I will say the 64 hand-wired Fender amps seem to have something magic that's a little bit more than the 65 reissues that are PCB. Is that all the hand wiring? I'm not sure, but doesn't seem to be hurting anything. And then if you want the most sort of, you know, labor intensive, where you know someone has sat and just meticulously put your amp together with the best parts by hand, and then have tested it to make sure that it's fantastic and everything works, and you want to take it out and it just look like a piece of art, that is point to point, like a car or a matchless. So there's our 3 types that we talked about: PCB, hand-wired, point to point. I would love to know in the comments what you guys think about those different methods. Do you have a favorite? Do you care? Does it matter at all when you're buying an amp? Tell me, you know, would you rather have PCB and a less expensive amp, or know that it's point to point and spend a little more money? Anything you think about that, I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear maybe some of your examples of the PCB / hand-wired / point to point that you love the most, maybe companies we're not aware of. So let us know in the comments what you're thinking, and make sure you hit like and subscribe. Click the bell to see all the other random content we put out on the channel. Lots of demos, lots of videos where Baxter and I discuss music and the fret buzz every week, and we will see you next time at Casino Guitars. Thanks so much for watching.